I'm 94 years old now, and when you live this long, people assume you've made peace with your past. They think time softens everything. Truth is, some things only grow heavier. I sit by the same window every morning, watching the sun crawl over the maple tree in my yard, and I tell myself the same lie I've told for most of my life, that what happened all those years ago was necessary, that it was the only choice I had. But lately, that lie doesn't hold together the way it used to. Maybe it's because most of the people who knew me back then are gone now. Maybe it's because when you're this close to the end, silence starts to feel like a kind of cowardice. Or maybe it's because last week, while cleaning out an old wooden box in my closet, I found something I hadn't seen in nearly 70 years, a photograph. The edges were yellow and cracked, but the moment I saw her face, my hands started shaking, because the woman in that photograph wasn't supposed to exist anymore. And the truth is, she shouldn't have. When I was a young man, people used to say I had a steady life ahead of me. Not exciting, maybe, but steady. I grew up in a small town where the streets were quiet and the same families lived there for generations. Everyone knew each other's business, whether they wanted to or not. My father ran a hardware store on the corner of Main and Willow, and by the time I was 22, I was working beside him most days. It wasn't the life I dreamed about as a boy, but it was a good life. Honest, predictable, and back then, predictable felt like safety. That was around the time I met Helen. She came into the store one rainy afternoon looking for nails and a hammer. I remember the way the water dripped from the edge of her coat onto the wooden floor, and how she apologized 3 times for making a mess before she even finished asking for help. Helen had this quiet way about her. Not shy exactly, just gentle. The kind of person who listened more than she spoke. I liked that about her. The truth is, I liked everything about her. We started seeing each other not long after that. Sunday walks by the river. Coffee at the little diner across from the church. Sometimes we'd sit on the bench near the train tracks and watch the evening trains roll through town, imagining all the places they were headed. Helen had never traveled far, but she liked hearing about the world. And I liked being the one to describe it. A year later, we were married in the small white church near the center of town. My mother cried during the ceremony. My father shook my hand like he had just completed some kind of business deal. And Helen looked at me with a kind of trust that felt almost frightening. Because when someone looks at you like that, they're giving you something fragile. And at the time, I believed I deserved it. The early years of our marriage were simple in the best way. We rented a little house on Birch Street. Nothing fancy, creaky floors, a narrow kitchen, and a porch that leaned slightly to the left. But Helen filled it with warmth. She planted flowers along the walkway. She cooked dinners that somehow made the whole place smell like home. And every night before bed, she'd sit beside me on the couch with a book in her hands, resting her head against my shoulder like that was the most natural place in the world to be. Back then, I believed my life had already taken its final shape. Work at the store during the day, evenings at home with Helen, maybe children someday. That was enough for me. But life has a strange way of introducing change when you least expect it. About 5 years into our marriage, the town started growing. Slowly at first, then all at once. New businesses opened. New families moved in. And one summer afternoon, a young woman walked into the hardware store asking about renting the old apartment upstairs. Her name was Margaret. She said she had just taken a job teaching at the elementary school and needed a place to stay. I remember thinking she seemed out of place in our quiet little town. She had this confidence about her that you didn't see much around here. She spoke quickly, laughed easily, and looked you directly in the eyes when she asked a question. It was different from Helen. Not better, just different. At first, Margaret was simply a tenant. She moved into the small apartment above the store, and every now and then she'd come downstairs to ask about fixing something. A loose cabinet hinge, a leaky faucet, a window that wouldn't close properly. I didn't think much of it. Helping people was part of the job. But over time, those small visits started lasting a little longer. She'd stay to talk, sometimes about the school, sometimes about the students she was teaching, other times about the places she'd lived before coming here, Chicago, Boston, even a year in California. To someone who had spent his entire life in one small town, those stories felt like glimpses into another world. One evening after closing the store, Margaret came downstairs holding a broken lamp. She asked if I could help fix it. It took maybe 10 minutes, but after I finished, we kept talking. I remember leaning against the counter while the late sunlight came through the front windows. Dust floated in the air like tiny sparks. Margaret told me about the ocean in California, how the water stretched so far you couldn't see the end of it. I had never seen the ocean, not once. And when she described it, something stirred inside me that I hadn't felt in years. A kind of restlessness. That night when I went home, Helen was in the kitchen baking bread. Flour dusted her hands, and the smell filled the whole house. She smiled the moment she saw me. "Long day?" she asked. I remember looking at her, really looking at her, and feeling a strange mix of comfort and guilt that I didn't understand yet. Because nothing had happened. Not really. But somewhere deep inside, a small crack had formed in the life I thought was unshakable. Margaret stayed in that apartment for nearly a year. During that time, we talked often, sometimes downstairs in the store, sometimes on the staircase when she was heading up and I was locking the front door for the night. Our conversations were harmless on the surface. But looking back now, I realized something dangerous was quietly growing in those moments. It wasn't love, not at first. It was curiosity about the world, about the life I might have lived if I had made different choices. And the worst part is, I didn't tell Helen any of it. Not about the long conversations. Not about the way Margaret made ordinary days feel a little less predictable. Helen trusted me completely. I could see it in the way she spoke to me, in the way she never once questioned where I'd been or what I was doing. That kind of trust is a gift most people don't fully understand until they've broken it. And at the time, I didn't realize how close I was to doing exactly that. Because one evening, everything changed. It was late autumn. The air had turned cold, and the streets were nearly empty. Margaret came down to the store just as I was locking up for the night. She said she needed help carrying a box upstairs. That was all. Just a simple favor. Something I'd done dozens of times before. But that night, when I stepped into that apartment, when the door closed behind us, a moment happened that would follow me for the rest of my life. I remember the sound the door made when it closed behind me. It wasn't loud, just a soft click. But something about that sound stayed with me. Even now, 70 years later, I can hear it as clearly as if it happened yesterday. Margaret set the box down on the small kitchen table and thanked me. It was nothing special inside, just books and a few papers from a school. But she seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. I should have left right then. Normally, I would have. A quick favor, a polite goodbye, and down the stairs I go. Helen would already be home, probably waiting with dinner warming on the stove. But that night, Margaret started talking. She said she'd received a letter earlier that afternoon, a job offer from a school in San Francisco. She spoke the name of that city like it belonged to another planet. Her eyes were bright, almost glowing, and she paced slowly across the room while she told me about it. More money, a bigger school, a chance to see the world beyond our quiet town. I listened, leaning against the counter, feeling something tight in my chest that I couldn't quite explain. Part of me was happy for her, but another part, a quieter part, felt like something important was slipping away. She stopped pacing after a moment and looked directly at me. "Have you ever thought about leaving this place?" she asked. It seemed like such a simple question, but it caught me off guard. I thought about the store downstairs, the same shelves my father had built, the same customers who had been coming there for years. I thought about our little house on Birch Street, the porch Helen loved to sit on during summer evenings. That was my life. Leaving had never really been an option. "I suppose I haven't," I told her. Margaret studied my face like she was trying to see something beneath the surface. "You seem like someone who could have gone anywhere," she said quietly. No one had ever said that to me before. In our town, people didn't talk that way. Lives followed familiar paths. You worked, you married, you stayed. But in that moment, the way Margaret said it made me wonder, just for a second, what life might have looked like if things had unfolded differently. That was the first mistake, letting the thought take root. We talked for nearly an hour that night, about travel, about cities neither of us had seen, about the strange ways people's lives turn depending on the choices they make. At some point, she poured 2 cups of coffee. At some point, the sun disappeared completely. And at some point, the distance between us in that small kitchen became smaller than it should have been. I remember her laughing at something I said. A simple laugh, warm and easy. And I remember noticing how close she was standing. That moment, that exact moment, is where everything could have stopped. But it didn't. What happened next wasn't dramatic. No grand declarations. No sudden rush of passion like you see in movies. It was quieter than that. Margaret reached out and touched my arm, just lightly. But when she did, something shifted in the room. A kind of silence settled between us. I should have stepped away. Instead, I didn't move at all. The truth is hard to admit after so many years. I knew exactly what was happening, and I let it happen. What followed lasted only a few minutes, maybe less. But those minutes changed the course of several lives. Afterward, the room felt smaller somehow. Margaret looked down at the table, her expression unreadable. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then she said something I've never forgotten. "This doesn't have to mean anything," she said quietly. At the time, those words felt like relief, like a door opening back toward the life I had before. I nodded, told her it was a mistake, and walked down the stairs without saying anything else. The cold air outside hit my face as I stepped onto the street, and suddenly the weight of what I had done settled over me. The walk home felt longer than usual. Every light in every house seemed too bright, every passing car too loud. By the time I reached Birch Street, I had convinced myself that nothing truly serious had happened. It was a mistake, one moment, something that could be forgotten. Helen was in the living room when I walked in. She looked up from her book and smiled. That same trusting smile she had given me for years. "Dinner's still warm," she said. I remember sitting at the table across from her, listening to her talk about a neighbor's new baby, about the flowers she wanted to plant in the spring. I nodded. I smiled. But inside, something had shifted permanently. The days that followed were strange. Margaret and I avoided each other at first. She stayed upstairs. I focused on work. Neither of us spoke about what had happened. For a while, I convinced myself the silence meant the problem had solved itself. But about 3 weeks later, Margaret came down to the store again. It was early morning. The shop was empty. She stood near the counter, her hands clasped together like she was trying to steady herself. "I'm leaving sooner than I thought," she said. I asked why. She hesitated. Then she told me something that made my entire body go cold. She was pregnant. Even now, remembering that moment makes my chest tighten. Because the world doesn't stop when you hear news like that. The clock keeps ticking. Dust keeps floating through the sunlight. Customers still walk through the door. But inside your mind, everything freezes. Margaret spoke calmly, almost too calmly. She said she didn't expect anything from me. She said she would leave town before anyone noticed. She said she would raise the child somewhere far away. No one has to know, she told me. At the time, those words felt like both mercy and punishment. Part of me wanted to confess everything to Helen, to face the damage honestly. But fear is a powerful thing. Fear of losing your marriage. Fear of destroying the life you built. Fear of becoming the man everyone whispers about. So I did the cowardly thing. I let Margaret leave. 2 weeks later, she was gone. The apartment above the store sat empty again. And slowly, life returned to the shape it had before. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Helen and I continued our routines. Years passed. We had children of our own. The store grew. Our town grew. From the outside, my life looked exactly like the steady future people once predicted for me. But every once in a while, late at night, a thought would creep into my mind. Somewhere in the world, there was a child who shared my blood. A child who would grow up never knowing my name. I buried that thought as deep as I could. Decades went by, and eventually, I convinced myself the past had faded beyond reach. Until last week, until that photograph. Because the woman in that picture, the one staring back at me from 70 years ago, wasn't Margaret. It was someone else. Someone who should have been impossible. And the truth behind that photograph is the secret I've carried my entire life. For 70 years, I believed the story ended the day Margaret left town. That was the version of the past I allowed myself to keep. A mistake. A child somewhere far away. A life that moved on without me. And over time, I learned how to fold that memory into a quiet corner of my mind. Not forgotten, but buried deep enough that it didn't interrupt the life Helen and I built together. We raised 2 children, a son and a daughter. I watched them grow, watched them stumble through their own mistakes, watched them fall in love and start families of their own. The hardware store stayed busy. The town grew larger, noisier. Roads were widened, buildings replaced. Life moved forward the way it always does. Helen and I grew older together. Her hair turned silver long before mine did. She developed a habit of humming softly while she cooked, the same tune over and over, though I never learned the name of it. Every evening, we still sat together in the living room, her with her books, me with the newspaper. A quiet life. And the strange thing about quiet lives is that people assume they must also be simple. But inside a man's mind, nothing is ever simple. Every now and then, I would find myself wondering about that child. A boy? A girl? Did they look like me? Did they inherit my father's stubborn chin or my mother's narrow eyes? I imagine them growing up somewhere near the ocean Margaret once described. I imagine them walking along those endless shores, never knowing that a small town man hundreds of miles away sometimes thought about them late at night. But imagination is a comfortable substitute for truth, because imagination doesn't force you to face consequences. And I told myself there was no way to ever know the truth anyway. Years passed, then decades. Margaret never returned. No letters, no phone calls, nothing. Eventually, the story of her faded into something distant, like a dream you once had but can't fully recall anymore. I was in my 70s when Helen and I finally sold the hardware store. My hands had started to ache too much to handle the heavier work, and our son had already moved his family to another city. It felt like the natural end of a long chapter. We spent more time at home after that, gardening, watching old movies, taking slow walks around the neighborhood. I remember thinking that whatever mistakes I'd made in life had somehow settled into the past where they belonged. Then Helen passed away. It happened quietly one winter morning. A heart problem the doctors had been watching for years. One moment she was there, beside me in the kitchen. The next she was gone. People say grief arrives like a storm. For me, it arrived like silence. The house felt too large, too still. Every corner carried echoes of her presence. I spent months wandering from room to room, touching objects that suddenly felt like relics from another lifetime. And that's how I ended up cleaning the closet last week. There was an old wooden box on the top shelf, one I hadn't opened in years. Inside were letters, receipts, old photographs, small pieces of a life stretching back decades. And near the bottom of that box, I found the photograph. At first, I thought it was Margaret. The same dark hair, the same shape of the eyes. But the more I looked, the more something felt different. The photograph showed a woman standing on a beach. The ocean stretched behind her just like Margaret had once described. She looked to be around 30 years old, but the photograph itself was newer than that, probably taken sometime in the 1980s. On the back was a name written in faded ink, Anna, and beneath it a short sentence, "Your father never knew." When I read those words, my heart started beating so hard I had to sit down, because suddenly everything made sense. Margaret never came back, but someone else had. Not in person, through that photograph, through that message, through a quiet truth left behind in a box I hadn't opened for decades. Anna wasn't Margaret. Anna was the child, my child. She must have come to town years ago. Maybe after Margaret passed away, maybe after discovering the truth about where she came from. She must have stood somewhere near this house. Maybe even walked past the store when it was still open, and she chose not to knock on the door. Instead, she left the photograph. A single sentence. "Your father never knew." For days after finding it, I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. Did she watch me from across the street? Did she see Helen and me walking together in the evenings? Did she decide our lives looked too complete to disturb? I will never know. That's the hardest part about the truth arriving late in life. There are no more chances to ask questions, no opportunities to explain, just silence. But the longer I sat with that photograph in my hands, the more one realization settled over me. My secret wasn't the affair. It wasn't even the child. The real secret, the one I carried all these years, was cowardice. I convinced myself that protecting my life with Helen justified my silence. I told myself the past was better left buried. But somewhere out there, a little girl grew into a woman, believing her father never knew she existed. And that simply isn't true. Because now I do know, and the weight of that knowledge is heavier than any secret I tried to bury. I'm 94 years old. My hands shake when I hold that photograph. My voice isn't as strong as it used to be. But if Anna is still alive somewhere in this world, I want her to hear this. I was wrong. I should have searched. I should have asked questions. I should have been brave enough to face the life I helped create. Instead, I chose comfort. And comfort is a dangerous thing when it replaces truth. If there's any lesson in a life as long as mine, it's this. The secrets we bury to protect ourselves don't disappear. They wait, quietly, patiently, until the day we finally understand what they truly cost.